Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you about the worst men of the Middle Ages. Sit back, close your eyes, immerse yourself in the story, and sleep peacefully. Don't forget subscribe and leave a comment. There is a kind of hunger that has nothing to do with taste. For most men living in medieval Europe, eating was not an act of pleasure. It was an act of survival, repeated 3 times a day, against food that was often coarse, sour, rancid, or barely edible by modern standards. Long before refrigeration, before food safety laws, before the idea that a meal should be enjoyable rather than endured, ordinary people sat down to eat things that would make a modern stomach turn. This is the story of what medieval men actually put in their mouths when there was no other choice. And what that tells us about a world built on scarcity, faith, and quiet endurance. Chapter 1. The Bread That Broke Teeth. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. But the bread eaten by a peasant bore little resemblance to anything soft or fine. While the wealthy ate loaves made from finely sifted white flour, the vast majority of the population ate bread made from whatever grain was available and affordable, often rye, barley, or oats, ground coarsely and mixed with bran that had not been properly removed. The milling process itself was imperfect. Millstones wore down over years of use, and tiny fragments of stone routinely broke off and mixed into the flour. Archaeologists studying medieval skeletons have found teeth worn down flat and cracked, a direct result of biting into bread that contained grit, sand, and stone dust with nearly every loaf. Eating bread, something we now think of as simple and comforting, was for a medieval peasant an act that slowly wore away the body itself. The taste was equally unforgiving. Coarse rye and barley bread had a dense, sour, almost Asian flavor, made worse in years of poor harvest when bakers stretched their flour with ground peas, beans, or even acorns to make the grain last longer. In the worst years, chaff, the inedible husk of the grain normally discarded, was left in or added back to bulk out the loaf. The result was a bread that was difficult to chew, difficult to digest, and almost entirely without the soft texture or mild flavor we associate with bread today. Yet this was eaten daily, by nearly everyone, because the alternative was not eating at all. There was also a hidden danger baked into this bread that had nothing to do with texture. Rye, the most common grain for the poor in many regions, was vulnerable to a fungus called ergot, which thrived in damp, poorly stored grain. Ergot-contaminated bread caused convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs, so severe that the condition became known as Saint Anthony's fire. Medieval people did not understand the cause, only that certain years, certain harvests, produced bread that made entire villages sick. They ate it anyway, because hunger left no room for caution, and because there was rarely any other bread to be had. Chapter 2. Pottage, the daily sludge. If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, pottage was its constant companion. Pottage was a thick-boiled mixture of grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables happened to be available, simmered for hours in a single pot hung over the household fire. It was the meal eaten morning, noon, and night by the vast majority of the population, a thick gray or brown sludge, with a texture somewhere between porridge and soup. The pot itself was rarely emptied or properly cleaned between meals. New ingredients were simply added to whatever remained from the day before, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, a practice that gave the dish a flat, stale undertone no amount of salt could fully mask. The flavor of pottage depended entirely on what a household could afford, and for most people that meant very little. Onions, leeks, and cabbage were common when in season, but meat was a luxury added only occasionally in small scraps, more for flavor than nourishment. In poorer households, the pottage was often nothing more than boiled grain and water, thickened further with oats or barley, seasoned whatever herbs grew wild nearby. There was no variation to look forward to, no sense of a meal as an event. Pottage was simply consumed, day after day, year after year. Its bland, and often slightly sour, taste a permanent fixture of medieval life. What made pottage particularly unpleasant by modern standards was not just its monotony, but its preparation. Cooking pots were made of iron or clay and were rarely scrubbed clean, allowing a buildup of burnt residue and fermented scraps to accumulate at the bottom over time. This residue mixed into every subsequent batch, giving long-used pots a uniquely bitter, almost rancid undertone that experienced cooks simply worked around rather than eliminated. For a medieval peasant, pottage was not eaten because it tasted good. It was eaten because it was filling, because it stretched scarce ingredients across an entire household, and because there was rarely anything better within reach. Chapter 3: Salted, Smoked, and Spoiled Meat. Meat in the medieval world was not the convenient, ever-available product it is today. Without refrigeration, every cut of meat had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or drying almost immediately after slaughter. And these methods, while effective at preventing total spoilage, did little to preserve flavor or texture. Salt pork and salt beef were packed tightly into barrels with coarse salt left for weeks. And the result was meat so dense with salt that it had to be soaked in water for hours, sometimes days, before it was even edible. Even after soaking, the meat retained a harsh, mineral sharpness that masked whatever natural flavor it once had. And the texture turned stringy and tough from the prolonged curing process. Smoking offered another method of preservation, hanging meat above the hearth fire for weeks at a time until it dried into a hard, leathery strip. This worked well enough to keep meat from rotting outright, but the result was a product closer to old leather than to anything resembling a fresh cut, requiring long boiling simply to make it chewable. And despite every precaution, preservation methods of the period were imperfect. Meat that had begun to turn was not always discarded, particularly among poorer households who could not afford to waste food. Spices, when available to the wealthy, were used, in part, to mask the early signs of spoilage. But for ordinary people there were no such spices to spare. A faint soreness, or off smell in meat was often simply tolerated, cooked longer in the hope that heat would make it safe, and eaten regardless. Winter made this worse. Once the cold months arrived and fresh meat became scarce, households relied entirely on whatever had been salted or smoked in the autumn slaughter. By late winter, even properly preserved meat had often turned rancid at the edges, the fat gone yellow and bitter, the surface slick with a film that any modern eater would immediately recognize as spoilage. Yet this meat represented weeks or months of careful rationing, and throwing it away was rarely an option. Men ate it anyway, trimming away the worst of the rot, boiling it long and hard, and accepting the bitter, off taste as simply the price of surviving until spring. Chapter 4: Fish Days and the Burden of Lent. For much of the medieval calendar, meat was forbidden entirely, not by scarcity but by religious law. The Church mandated that Fridays, the entirety of Lent, and numerous other holy days be observed through abstinence from meat, and on these days fish became the only acceptable source of protein. For coastal communities this was manageable, but for the much larger inland population, fresh fish was nearly impossible to obtain, and the solution was dried, salted, or pickled fish transported and stored for months at a time. Stockfish, unsalted fish dried stiff in open air until it resembled a plank of wood, was a staple traded across much of medieval Europe. Before it could be eaten, it had to be beaten with a mallet to break down its hardened fibers, then soaked in water for a day or more to soften it enough to cook. Even after this lengthy preparation, the flavor remained intensely fishy, with a tough, fibrous texture that bore little resemblance to fresh fish. Salted herring, the other dominant preserved fish of the period, was packed in barrels much like salt meat, and carried the same overwhelming salinity that required extensive soaking before it was tolerable to eat, because fasting days occurred so frequently throughout the year, often making up roughly a third of the calendar. This preserved fish was not an occasional inconvenience, but a near constant presence at the table. For many ordinary people, the taste of old, oversalted, intensely fishy stockfish became as familiar and unavoidable as the taste of coarse bread. It was eaten not for pleasure, but in obedience, a religious duty that asked the body to tolerate flavors it would never have chosen on its own, repeated week after week for an entire lifetime. Chapter 5: Sour Ale and Bitter Wine. Drinking water in medieval towns and cities was often unsafe, drawn from rivers and wells contaminated by waste and runoff. And so most people, including children, drank ale or weak wine as their primary daily beverage instead. This was not the carefully brewed beer of later centuries. Medieval small ale, the everyday drink consumed by laborers and peasants, was brewed quickly and weakly, often reusing the same grain mash multiple times to stretch a limited supply of barley as far as possible. Each subsequent brewing produced a thinner, more sour, less alcoholic ale, flat in flavor, and often slightly off due to inconsistent fermentation in unsanitary brewing conditions. Wine fared little better for those who'd not afford the finest vintages. Cheap wine, the kind available to ordinary townspeople, was prone to turning vinegary within weeks of opening, since there was no reliable way to seal a cask once broached. Many households simply continued drinking wine well past the point where it had begun souring, accepting a sharp, acidic bite as a normal part of its character, rather than a sign it should be discarded. In some cases, spoiled wine was deliberately repurposed as vinegar for cooking, a practical solution that nonetheless reveals how thin the line was between drinkable wine and outright spoilage. The result was a population that drank, almost constantly throughout the day, a beverage that by modern standards would be considered flat, sour, and frequently on the edge of spoiled. Yet this was simply how liquids were consumed. The bitterness and sourness of Dale ale and wine were not flaws to be corrected, but background conditions of life, tolerated the same way coarse bread and salted meat were tolerated, because the alternative, untreated water, carried a far greater risk than an unpleasant taste. Chapter 6: Famine Foods. Even the major, unpleasant diet of an ordinary year was a luxury compared to what happened when harvests failed. Medieval Europe experienced repeated waves of famine, and in these periods, people turned to foods that under normal circumstances would never have been considered edible at all. Tree bark, particularly the soft inner layer of certain trees, was dried, ground into a coarse powder, and mixed into what little flour remained to stretch bread further, producing a loaf that was bitter, fibrous, and nearly impossible to digest properly. Acorns, normally fed to pigs, were boiled repeatedly to leach out their natural bitterness, and then ground into a rough flour of their own. Though even after extensive preparation, the resulting bread retained a harsh, tannic aftertaste. Wild plants and weeds that grew at the margins of fields, normally ignored or actively cleared, became critical sources of nutrition during the worst famine years. Nettles, dock leaves, and various roots were boiled into pottage in place of grain, their flavors often bitter or astringent, offering calories but little comfort. Chroniclers from several famine periods recorded that people resorted to eating grass itself, boiled in an attempt to extract some nourishment, with predictably poor results both in taste and in the body's ability to process it. These were not foods chosen for survival in the abstract sense, but foods eaten while watching neighbors and family members starve, where the unpleasantness of taste became entirely irrelevant against the threat of death. In the most severe and prolonged famines, historical accounts describe communities reduced to eating the leather of shoes and harnesses, boiled for hours in an attempt to soften it into something chewable, and in the very worst documented cases, instances of cannibalism among the desperate, dying. These extremes were rare, recorded as horrifying exceptions rather than routine occurrences. But their existence in the historical record underscores just how thin the margin was between an ordinary medieval diet, already coarse and unpleasant by modern standards, and complete starvation. Famine foods were not eaten despite their terrible taste. Taste, by that point, had ceased to matter at all. Chapter 7: Medicine that tasted like punishment. Beyond food, medieval medicine demanded its own form of endurance, and the remedies prescribed by physicians and healers were often as unpleasant as anything found on the dinner table. Bitter herbal concoctions formed the backbone of medieval treatment, brewed from plants like wormwood, gentian, and rue, chosen specifically for their intensely bitter properties. Since bitterness itself was widely believed to indicate medicinal strength, patients drank these preparations not in small sips, but in full doses, swallowing a flavor so harsh it was often compared by contemporary writers to bile itself. Purgatives were among the most commonly prescribed treatments of the period, used to address everything from fever to melancholy. And they worked by inducing vomiting or violent diarrhea, theoretically expelling whatever imbalance of bodily humors was believed to be causing illness. The ingredients used to produce this effect, often including senna, hellebore, or other strong botanical compounds, carried flavors so unpleasant that the treatment itself became something patients dreaded as much as the illness it was meant to cure. Variac, an elaborate remedy believed to cure poison and a wide range of ailments, was composed of dozens of ingredients, some bitter, some pungent, blended into a thick paste that had to be consumed despite a flavor profile most modern palates would find genuinely repulsive. What made medieval medicine particularly difficult to endure was the prevailing belief that effectiveness and unpleasantness were directly linked. A remedy that tasted mild or pleasant was often dismissed as too weak to be of any real use, while the most bitter, foul-tasting preparations were trusted precisely because of how badly they tasted. Patients did not tolerate this bitterness as an unfortunate side effect of treatment. They expected it, and in many cases sought it out, swallowing remedies that turned the act of healing into its own small ordeal. Chapter 8: The Table of the Wealthy versus the Poor. The unpleasant tastes that defined the medieval diet were not universal. They were, in large part, a condition of poverty, and the gap between what the wealthy ate and what ordinary people endured was vast. While peasants chewed through gritty bread and bland pottage, noble households had access to finely sifted white bread, fresh meat slaughtered specifically for the table rather than preserved for months, and an extraordinary range of imported spices, including pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, brought at great expense along trade routes stretching as far as Asia. These spices did more than flavor food. They signaled status, transforming a meal into a visible display of wealth that the poor could never replicate. Sugar, in particular, was a luxury almost entirely reserved for the elite, used sparingly in the dishes of the wealthy, while remaining completely absent from the diet of ordinary people, whose only access to sweetness came from occasional honey, when it was available at all. Fresh fruit, properly stored ice for preserving delicate dishes, and skilled cooks employed specifically to prepare elaborate feasts, all features of noble life that had no equivalent among the peasantry. A wealthy household might enjoy a roasted swan dressed in elaborate spiced sauce, while a family working that same lord's land subsisted on the same gray pottage and sour bread day after day for their entire lives. This contrast was not incidental. It was in many ways the entire point. Flavor itself became a marker of social position in medieval society, where the ability to mask, enhance, transform the natural taste of food with rare and costly ingredients was available only to those at the very top of the social order. For everyone else, taste remained secondary to survival, a luxury that simply did not factor into the daily calculation of how to get enough calories to live through another season. Chapter 9. Closing Reflection. What emerges from this history is not simply a list of unpleasant foods, but a portrait of a world built on quiet, constant endurance. Medieval men did not eat gritty bread, sour ale, rancid meat, and bitter medicine because they lacked any sense of taste or preference. They ate these things because the margin between survival and starvation was thin, because preservation technology was limited, because religious obligation demanded it, and because the comforts taken for granted today, refrigeration, food safety standards, reliable harvests, simply did not exist. Every unpleasant meal was a small negotiation between hunger and hardship, repeated daily across an entire lifetime. There is something worth recognizing in this resilience. The medieval body adapted to flavors and textures that would be considered intolerable today, not through choice, but through necessity, and an entire civilization was built on the back of that quiet tolerance. The peasant who finished a bowl of stale pottage, the laborer who drank his third cup of sour ale, the sick man who swallowed a foul purgative without complaint. None of them saw themselves as remarkable. They were simply living the only way they knew how in a world that offered very little room for anything else. To look back on this history is to understand comfort, convenience, and pleasant taste are not constants of human life, but relatively recent privileges, hard-won through centuries of advancement in agriculture, science, and trade. The next time a meal tastes exactly as expected, fresh, clean, free of grit or rot or bitterness, it is worth remembering that for most of human history, and for most of the people who lived through the medieval centuries, that simple expectation would have seemed like impossible luxury.